Okay, moving on to the next segment of today's show. If you guys have been listening to the last couple episodes of the Zach Krell Sports Podcast, each episode at the back end, I've been picking a different division throughout the National Football League and then going over each team in that division's draft and where I currently have them and what I currently think of them. And today, the division we're going to be doing that with is the NFC East. And the first team in the NFC East whose drafts I want to go over is Dave Gettleman and the New York Giants. And Dave Gettleman has been very interesting in drafts because I feel like he hasn't necessarily always gone with the consensus opinion in terms of what exactly the fans want him to do with his team. But at the same time, that doesn't mean he hasn't been unsuccessful during the draft. I think Daniel Jones right now, most Giant fans think he's been a pretty solid pick. I understand the circumstances weren't great when they took Saquon Barkley at number 2 overall, but there's no doubt he's a very good player. And I think the New York Giants kind of did something similar to that in this draft with the number 4 overall pick. They took Andrew Thomas, the offensive tackle from the University of Georgia. And I think when I look at this pick, no doubt offensive line was a big need. Nate Solder, the Giants paid him some big-time money a couple weeks ago. It obviously hasn't really worked out, and they need offensive line help. They need to protect their young asset in Daniel Jones, and even though I did like some of the offensive linemen in this draft a little bit better than Andrew Thomas, like Wirfs and Wills, I don't think Andrew Thomas was a bad pick. I think if he turns out to be a good player, that will end up being a pretty good selection for the New York Giants. With their second pick, they take safety from Alabama, Xavier McKinney, with the number 36 overall pick. And I think this was a pretty solid pick as well. The New York Giants are a team whose defense wasn't very good last year. And they really do need secondary help, especially with the report that dropped yesterday about DeAndre Baker. I mean, you take a corner in the first round just last year who was not very good on the football field this past season, and you see that happen to him. Not a very good look for DeAndre Baker, but we're going to get to that on another day. But anyway, I like the Giants' pick of Xavier McKinney. I think it was pretty solid. McKinney was a guy that a lot of people projected to be a top 15-ish type pick. And especially in a secondary unit that always needs help. I like that pick for the Giants. And then with the 99th pick, they took Matt Pert, the offensive tackle from UConn. And I'm not going to be criticizing that pick as well because they just need that position. You know, they need as many offensive linemen as possible to protect Daniel Jones. And with that being said, I'm going to give the New York Giants draft a flat B. Personally, would I have taken Andrew Thomas with the number 4 overall pick? No, but Dave Gettleman selected the guy he really liked, and it's going to only take some time to see if that pick works out or not. I like the McKinney pick as well. I think he could be a really good player. I think he's very hard-hitting. The Giants did have the choice between McKinney and Delpit, and most people did have McKinney as the higher-ranked player, even though it was close. So from that perspective, I think the Giants made the right decision there. And you could never, especially when a player of McKinney's caliber is still on the board, you can never pass that up when he was projected to be like a top 15, top 20 pick. So I'm going to give the New York Giants draft a B+, flat B. I think they did a pretty solid job. And I actually don't think the Giants are too far away from being okay next season. Okay, moving on to the next team's draft we will be breaking down, and that will be the Philadelphia Eagles. And the Eagles were a team that the couple podcasts after the draft, I actually spent a decent amount of time on because I didn't love that they let the Dallas Cowboys stay exactly where they were at pick 17 and snatch a guy in CD Lamb off the board who a lot of people thought could have been the best receiver in the draft, when you also combine the fact that going into this draft, wide receiver was a very big position of need for this Philadelphia Eagles team. You remember last year, they just couldn't stay healthy and didn't have many weapons for Carson Wentz to throw the ball, but they did end up taking a wide receiver with the number 21 overall pick, Jalen Reagor, at a TCU. I was a little surprised that they didn't end up taking Justin Jefferson, the wide receiver out of LSU, because Doug Peterson is from Louisiana. He has a history of taking some players from there, but they end up going with Jalen Reagor, the wide receiver from TCU, with the number 21 overall pick. And then this was one of the more surprising picks of the draft with the number 53 pick. The Philadelphia Eagles selected Jalen Hurts, the quarterback from Oklahoma. And just like everyone, this is a pretty surprising pick. when you consider the Philadelphia Eagles do have a young quarterback in Carson Wentz that they, I think, should really, rely heavily on still. But at the same time, Carson Wentz over the past couple seasons has just had a really hard time staying healthy. And if the Eagles wanted to get him some insurance, I get it. But at the same time, I think if I was Howie Roseman, I probably would have handled the situation a little more differently, just because there were some veteran quarterbacks available on the free agent market, like Jameis Winston, like Cam Newton, like Andy Dalton. They could have signed him after he got cut from the Cincinnati Bengals. But at the same time, this team needs weapons. The Eagles were good last year, and Carson Wentz was able to win games with not many weapons, but he didn't have any wide receivers. And even though he has two very good tight ends, he loses one of the better offensive linemen in the league in Jason Peters. The Eagles' defense certainly isn't perfect. I don't know. I just think I probably would have filled another hole, especially if Carson Wentz gets hurt, I don't think you're going to want to throw in Jalen Hurts right away at quarterback and expect him and your team to win a championship. I don't think, quarterback aside, I'm high on the Eagles because of Carson Wentz mostly, but I think this Eagles roster minus the quarterback is still pretty solid, where if you take a Jameis Winston or a Cam Newton and you put them on the team, I think they can maybe lead them to the playoffs. You saw Nick Foles do that only a couple seasons ago. But at the same time, if Carson Wentz gets hurt, I'm not comfortable putting a rookie quarterback in that has never stepped on the field. You're going to want to see that guy develop. And especially when you take him in the second round, I just didn't love that pick. When you also consider the fact, I heard some people say that, Jalen Hurts is just going to be used in option plays like Taysom Hill is with the New Orleans Saints. Well, that's fine, except for two problems I have. One, Jalen Hurts is a much better thrower of the football than Taysom Hill. I think he's a more established quarterback is than Taysom Hill. I understand Taysom Hill was a college quarterback at BYU and he was okay, but Jalen Hurts literally was in the Heisman conversation for multiple years during his time with Alabama. So I don't think you're just going to insert him in gadget plays and be okay, that's why we spent the second round pick on him. I think the reason why, if you're the Philadelphia Eagles, you take Jalen Hurts is because you want to get him in the game. And when you have a quarterback like Carson Wentz, I just don't necessarily know if that was the right decision. So with that being said, I'm going to give the Eagles draft a C. I didn't love the Rieger pick. I think it was a little bit of a reach. Plus, they let Dallas trade up and get CeeDee Lamb. And I didn't love their pick to get Jalen Hurts. They also took Davion Taylor, the outside linebacker from Colorado in the third round, 103 overall, and then later they ended up going with Kevon Wallace, the safety from Clemson, in the fourth round, which does fill a need. But I'm going to give the Eagles draft a C, man. I just think they reached a little bit for Rieger, and they really just didn't need to take Jalen Hurts. Okay, moving on to the next team in the NFC East whose draft we'll be going over. That would be the Dallas Cowboys. And Dallas, with the 17th pick, took CeeDee Lamb, the wide receiver from Oklahoma. One thing about the Cowboys roster and the way it's shaped that not a lot of people realized going into this draft was that even though they just signed Amari Cooper to a big-time deal, and even though they still have Michael Gallup, one of the better young receivers in football, besides those two guys, they lost Randall Cobb, and they didn't really have a third weapon and a third wide receiver for Dak to throw the football to going into this season. And that's why I love this pick of CeeDee Lamb, is because they kind of thought to themselves, all right, even though we didn't really go into this draft expecting to be in contention for a player like CeeDee Lamb, he falls all the way to us, and it could help our quarterback. It has to be the move, and that's exactly what they did. They ended up taking CeeDee Lamb with the 17th overall pick in the draft. With the number 51 pick, they take Trevon Diggs, the corner from Alabama. With the 82 pick, they take Neville Gallimore, the defensive tackle from Oklahoma. And I'm going to give this Dallas Cowboy draft an A-. I think it was a pretty solid draft. I like what they did taking CeeDee Lamb. I like what they did getting Trevon Diggs. I don't necessarily know how good of a player he will be, because I heard some people saying he could be a first-round pick. I don't really know about that, but I think in this mid-second round, that's a solid pick. And Gallimore, it always helps to beef up the defensive line. So I think CeeDee Lamb is a good player. Usually Jerry Jones has some history of kind of taking the flashy name instead of the name that will always make the team better. And even though CeeDee Lamb is a very known name, I didn't really see that to be the case just because he's such a dynamic playmaking receiver. So I'm going to give the Dallas Cowboys draft an A-. I actually really like what they did, and you just hope that they can improve going into next season, because because last year talent wasn't the problem in Dallas, and we're going to get to that on the back end of today's show, talking about what my expectations are for each of the 4 teams in the NFC East. I think CeeDee Lamb is a guy that will only help the Cowboys' expectations and team going into 2020. So I'm going to give their draft an A-. And then moving on to the final team whose draft we will be going over today, that would be the Washington Redskins. And the team in Washington, the Redskins, they were in draft headlines for a bit because they had the number 2 pick, and with that pick, they took Chase Young, the defensive end edge rusher from Ohio State. They actually, after that, weren't on the clock until pick number 66 of the 3rd round, and with that pick, they took Antonio Gibson, the running back from Memphis, and then with the number 108 pick, they take Sadiq Charles, the offensive tackle from LSU. And then after that, at 142, they get Dwayne Haskins, another weapon, as they take Antonio Gandy Golden, the big wide receiver from Liberty. I'm going to give the Redskins draft a B, a flat B, because obviously they made the right pick taking Chase Young. It was unfortunate that they didn't have a pick in the 2nd round or another one in the 1st round, because I just think even though they have some good young defensive players, there are so many holes on the Redskins roster. So even though they got Chase Young, who's going to be a good player, they could have just filled as many holes as possible. I don't necessarily know if trading out of the number 2 pick would have been the way to do it, but there are just a lot of holes on this Redskin team. They take Antonio Gibson, the running back. I didn't love that pick in the 3rd round because I actually think Darius Geis could be a big-time running back for this Redskin team, and they just have so many other holes to fill. But with that being said, I like the Sadiq Charles pick in the 4th round. I think that's a pretty solid value pick, and they take Antonio Gandy Golden at number 142 overall. He's a guy that I think could make some plays for them. They also take Keith Ishmael, the center from San Diego State, and Khalid Hudson, the outside linebacker from Michigan. So I think if you're a Redskin fan, hopefully those guys can make an impact. But at the same time, getting Chase Young on your team is always something really good that could help a lot of people. So it's going to be interesting to see how exactly the future in Washington plays out. This team hasn't really been good in a long time, but with Ron Rivera there, they are hoping to establish some new culture in Washington. So my draft for the Redskins grade was a B.